The desert does not reveal itself all at once. It resists. Its surface appears empty, but beneath the hardened crust lies a memory older than the dunes themselves. Wind passes over stone and sand, erasing tracks, smoothing edges, burying what once stood exposed. Time here does not rush. It presses downward, layer by layer, until movement becomes stillness, and stillness becomes record. Long before the desert learned to be silent, it was a place of motion. Water once moved across this land, slow and seasonal, leaving behind channels that hardened into scars. Grass grew where now there is dust. Animals passed through in great numbers, following paths remembered not by maps, but by instinct. Human groups moved among them, cautious and alert, shaped by hunger and heat, never staying long, never leaving marks meant to last. Survival in this place depended on restraint. Tools were simple, shelters were temporary, fire was guarded carefully, never allowed to wander far from the hands that fed it. The land offered little forgiveness. Mistakes were not corrected, they were absorbed. For generations, these people moved without altering the earth in ways that endured. Their presence faded with each season, their lives marked only in bone fragments scattered by scavengers, in hearths broken down by rain, in footprints erased by wind. Nothing here was meant to remain. Then something changed. It did not arrive suddenly. There was no signal, no clear beginning. The shift came quietly, emerging from a pattern of repeated choices, each one small, each one responding to the same pressures that had always governed life here. Scarcity tightened its grip, water became less predictable, animals altered their routes, familiar plants failed to return after the rains. The people adapted as they always had, adjusting movement, adjusting diet, adjusting expectation. But adaptation alone no longer felt sufficient. The land was changing faster than memory could track. The old paths no longer led to certainty. The world had become unreliable. In this uncertainty, attention turned inward, not away from the land, but deeper into it. Observation became slower, more deliberate. Stone was no longer chosen only for sharpness or weight, but for surface. Bone was no longer valued only for strength, but for shape. Hands lingered where once they moved quickly. The act itself was simple. A piece of stone was held longer than necessary. A line was drawn where none was required. Not to improve function, not to aid survival directly, the mark served no immediate purpose. It did not cut, it did not scrape, it did not feed fire. It remained. At first, the marks were hesitant, short incisions, shallow grooves, barely visible unless the light struck at the right angle. They followed natural contours, respecting the stone's form rather than imposing upon it. There was no attempt to dominate the material, only to engage with it. These early traces did not announce themselves. They blended into the object, easy to overlook, easy to dismiss. But to the hands that made them, they were deliberate. They required time. Time taken away from foraging, from watchfulness, from rest. Time spent with no guarantee of return. In a landscape where energy was measured carefully, this was a risk. The marks began to repeat. Similar patterns appeared on different objects, separated by distance, but bound by intention. Lines curved in familiar ways, shapes echoed one another. The hands that carved them belonged to different individuals, but the impulse was shared. The objects were not hidden, they were carried, placed near hearths, set among tools used daily. They entered the rhythm of life without explanation. Children handled them, elders glanced at them without comment. No words were attached, none were needed. The desert observed without response. As seasons passed, the marks grew more confident. Lines deepened. Surfaces were prepared before carving, smoothed deliberately. The makers began to anticipate the outcome, adjusting pressure, angle, rhythm. The act became practiced. Still, the meaning remained unstated. These objects did not depict animals clearly, nor did they resemble the landscape directly. They were not records of hunts or celebrations of success. They did not instruct. They did not warn. They existed in a space between recognition and abstraction, familiar yet unresolved. What they offered was continuity. In a world where the land shifted and resources failed, these marks did not disappear. They endured heat and cold. They survived drought. They remained when paths vanished and camps were abandoned. When groups returned after long absences, the objects were still there, waiting. This persistence altered behavior. People began to return not only for water or shelter, but for the objects themselves. Camps were chosen with reference to what had been left behind. Movement patterns adjusted subtly, influenced by memory anchored in stone rather than in terrain alone. The desert began to hold human time. This anchoring had consequences. Staying longer in one place meant greater familiarity with its limits. Resources were tested more thoroughly. The land's tolerance was measured, sometimes exceeded. Small successes encouraged repetition. Small failures accumulated. As pressure increased, the markings took on greater complexity. Multiple surfaces were worked together, patterns intersected, negative space was considered. The maker now thought beyond the single gesture, beyond the moment. This was no longer idle action. It required planning. The act of marking became communal, without becoming ceremonial. Individuals worked alone, but others watched. Techniques spread, preferences emerged. Some surfaces were avoided, others were favored. A shared aesthetic formed quietly, without decree. The objects were still not explained. They were not assigned names or stories. They did not belong to one individual. They belonged to the place. As the environment continued its slow retreat from abundance, tension increased. Encounters with predators became more frequent. Competition with other groups sharpened. Movements were monitored. Boundaries, once fluid, began to harden. The marked objects now served an unspoken role. They signaled presence, not aggressively, not as warning, but as evidence of return. They said that people had been here before and might be here again. This knowledge altered decisions. Approaches were cautious, camps were spaced differently. Encounters were negotiated through avoidance rather than confrontation. The marks did not enforce peace, they enabled awareness. Over time, the act of marking shifted again. It moved from portable objects to fixed surfaces. Rock faces were chosen carefully, often near water or overlooking broad expanses of land. The stone was harder, the effort greater, the risk higher. These marks could not be carried away. Carving into the land itself required commitment. It meant returning. It meant exposure. It meant leaving something that others could find. The first rock surfaces were marked sparingly, a single form, a limited area. The stone resisted, forcing patience. Mistakes could not be corrected easily. Each line was final. The decision to carve here was not taken lightly. Once begun, it did not stop. Generations added to the same surfaces. Some respected earlier marks, working around them. Others carved over them, deepening lines, altering shapes. The stone became layered with intention, each phase responding to what came before. The land now bore a record of thought. As climate continued to deteriorate, these sites became focal points. Groups gathered nearby more often, drawn by familiarity in an unfamiliar world. The rock faces became reference points, not just in space, but in time. Children grew up seeing the same marks their elders had known. The continuity was subtle but profound. Memory no longer relied solely on storytelling or imitation. It was embedded in the environment. The desert, once indifferent, now held traces of human persistence. This persistence carried risk.
Fixed sites attracted attention. Others noticed. Not all arrivals were cautious. Some damaged surfaces. Some attempted to erase or replace earlier marks. Conflict, once avoidable through movement, became harder to escape. Yet the sites endured. The marks were not defended aggressively. They were not claimed through force. Their protection came through repetition. Damage was repaired. New lines were added. Absence was filled with presence. Over long spans of time, the original impulse faded from memory. No one remembered the first hesitant lines. No one recalled the moment when marking had shifted from incidental to intentional. What remained was practice. The act was no longer questioned. Even as groups fractured and migrated, the tradition persisted. New hands learned old patterns. Variations emerged, but the underlying logic remained. The marks were made because they had always been made. The desert changed again. Water withdrew further. Vegetation thinned. Some sites were abandoned. Sand crept over rock faces, obscuring parts of the record. But beneath the cover, the marks waited. They would wait longer than the people who made them. When later humans would uncover these surfaces, they would see only fragments, isolated symbols, partial sequences. They would struggle to assign meaning, to categorize, to explain. Much would remain uncertain. What they would not see is the decision that began it all, the quiet moment when a hand paused, when time was taken without necessity, when survival made room for permanence. That moment did not announce itself. It did not claim importance. It passed unnoticed by those who lived it. Yet it altered the relationship between humans and land forever. The desert still resists. It continues to erase. But beneath the sand, the stone remembers.
Time flows differently where the desert holds memory. A buried surface, once marked, becomes a silent witness. Its presence is not obvious, yet it exerts subtle influence. Groups navigating the dunes adjust paths unconsciously. They pause where others paused centuries before. They rest where shade once offered refuge, following rhythms etched in stone rather than instinct alone. Awareness of place becomes layered. The land carries both threat and reassurance simultaneously. Life is measured against these traces, and decisions are weighed more carefully. A rock face carved generations past guides movement as much as the wind, as much as the presence of water. The permanence of these marks encourages longer observation. The makers begin to anticipate seasonal change with greater attention. The migration of animals, the opening of water holes, the arrival of storms, all are noted and embedded into mental maps, reinforced by the presence of carved stone. Memory is no longer private. It exists in the intersection of hand, rock, and environment. Knowledge becomes shared without words, transmitted silently through proximity and repetition. Survival becomes entwined with observation of what endures. The act of returning to marked surfaces alters social structures. Elders, once valued solely for survival skill, now carry the additional authority of memory. They guide younger members not only through foraging routes, but toward sites of accumulated understanding. Children grow up recognizing these places as important. They learn patience by tracing familiar lines, learning how careful repetition can shape permanence. Life, once ephemeral, begins to interact with a history longer than the immediate season. As this practice spreads, a new behavioral shift emerges. Tools and objects start to carry not only utility, but significance. A scraper or bone fragment may be left intentionally, positioned in relation to markings, suggesting a sense of spatial hierarchy or intention. Objects become signals of presence and continuity rather than solely instruments of survival. Care is taken in selection and placement. The desert, previously indifferent, now absorbs these choices. Humans begin to register the environment as a canvas, consciously or unconsciously, mediating the world around them not just for immediate need, but for something enduring.
The sites themselves evolve. Early shallow incisions deepen, lines intersect and diverge. Surfaces once small and isolated are joined by a network of carvings stretching across stone faces and boulders. The desert, shaped by wind and rain, adds unpredictability, forcing adaptation. Markings become increasingly resilient to erosion. Objects are positioned to survive floods and sand drifts. These changes are deliberate, made with awareness of time beyond a single life. The behavioral impulse that began as curiosity now operates as preservation. A layered relationship forms between humans and environment. Choices once purely functional now consider permanence. Each season brings risk, yet repeated visits reinforce commitment. Individuals begin to recognize that their actions echo beyond immediate survival. This awareness fosters new cognitive patterns, planning, patience, deferred outcomes. It is subtle, almost imperceptible. No words are needed to mark the transition. Encounters with predators continue to shape behavior. The presence of marking sites influences movement not by guiding animals, but by modifying human vigilance. Groups linger longer near familiar stone, their attention divided between potential threats and the act of observation. Fires are lit carefully, tracks are covered. No place is entirely safe, but familiarity creates measured security. Risk is weighed against history, and memory mediates fear. Over generations, the act of marking begins to influence the perception of the landscape itself. Rocks are no longer anonymous. Groves of boulders become focal points. Valleys are mapped through accumulated marks. Spatial awareness develops beyond survival instincts. Movement patterns are no longer solely reactive. They carry intention shaped by the environment as a living record. Individuals navigate not only terrain, but the traces left by those who came before, adjusting behavior in response to permanence, even when meaning is unknown. The emergence of these sites coincide with subtle demographic shifts. Groups consolidate temporarily near marked areas, drawn by recognition of prior habitation. Shelter is positioned in relation to carvings, rather than water or wind alone. Social patterns adjust quietly. Leaders emerge through familiarity with sites and accumulated knowledge. Memory and observation now guide hierarchy as much as physical ability. These shifts are gradual, imperceptible to those experiencing them, yet profound in cumulative effect. Marking surfaces becomes a form of timekeeping. Sequences are repeated seasonally, creating a silent calendar aligned with celestial and environmental cycles. Humans monitor plant growth, rainfall, and animal migration in relation to fixed stone markers. The desert, long indifferent, now participates in a dialogue of endurance. Actions of past generations inform present behavior, and present actions prepare for future return. The landscape itself becomes a repository of experience, a slow archive of intention.
The objects carried between sites maintain continuity. Tools, fragments, and marked stones move across terrain, creating networks of memory in space as well as time. A hearthstone, carved lightly, may be left in one camp and found hundreds of paces away in another. The repetition of form links groups separated by distance. Humans are connected to one another through material presence as much as through direct interaction. The desert mediates this connection silently, allowing communication across seasons. Conflict is rare, but when it occurs, the marking tradition mediates behavior. Sites are not defended through force, but through recognition. Damage is repaired, omissions restored. The act of restoration itself reinforces social cohesion and shared attention. Cooperation emerges from shared investment in permanence. Presence becomes meaningful not only for survival, but for continuity. Through centuries, the environment continues its slow transformation. Sand accumulates, water recedes, predators shift. The desert imposes limits, yet the carved surfaces endure. Each generation adds subtly, responding to both the land and the accumulated record of those who preceded them.
The objects and markings are no longer experimental. They are integral to the social and cognitive fabric of these groups. They shape not only movement and memory, but identity. The carvings themselves evolve in complexity. Lines intersect, creating patterns that suggest order without clear representation. Surfaces are worked with intent, echoing sequences found elsewhere, forming a network of form that can be traced across distance. The repetition fosters recognition, not of explicit meaning, but of presence and continuity. Each mark becomes a testament to endurance. Children grow up handling these objects, tracing familiar grooves with careful fingers. Hands learn rhythm and pressure. Patience becomes embedded in the body as much as in the mind. Observation is cultivated. Curiosity is disciplined. The desert, long a harsh teacher, now operates alongside human intention, shaping skill and awareness. As time continues, the sites are sometimes abandoned temporarily. Wind covers surfaces with sand. Bones and tools are buried, yet the intention persists beneath concealment. Return is almost inevitable. The memory embedded in stone guides movement back to these spaces. Survival, curiosity, and recognition of permanence converge. Humans act as if they sense what is buried beneath the shifting earth. Even when original creators are long gone, successors continue the practice. Meaning may be partially lost, form remains. Patterns are repeated. The landscape absorbs human attention and mediates behavior without instruction. Continuity is maintained through repetition, observation, and engagement with the environment. Eventually, centuries accumulate. Layers of mark, use, repair, and abandonment intersect. The desert conceals and preserves simultaneously. Objects, rock faces, and placement form a network that stretches across time. Humans are guided by the traces of those who came before, often unaware of the full significance. Decisions that seemed small become pivotal. Survival is intertwined with memory, movement, and subtle recognition of permanence. When modern eyes uncover these sites, the carvings are enigmatic. The sequence of marks, objects, and placement appears deliberate yet unresolved. No legend survives, no narrative is attached, only the evidence remains. Human hands, time, and environment converging in persistent form. Archaeologists will assign terms, describe style, date the surfaces, yet the essential decision, the quiet pause, the deliberate mark without immediate necessity, remains elusive. The desert is unchanged in its essential character. Wind and sand continue to move relentlessly. Predators still roam. Water remains scarce. The land tolerates nothing that is weak. Yet within its harshness, the traces of intention endure. They are silent witnesses to human cognition, creativity, and persistence. Each mark carries a subtle echo of fear, curiosity, and the slow recognition of consequence. The act that began as a hesitation has become a continuum. Objects and surfaces connect generations. Memory is embedded in environment, guiding behavior, shaping perception, and mediating survival. The desert holds these traces as quietly as it shifts dunes, as inevitable as the passing of seasons. In the final measure, no ceremony announces the achievement. No one records triumph or failure. The markings are not celebrated, they are present. They endure. Their significance is revealed not in explanation, but in persistence. Time, wind, sand, and human intention have converged. The desert conceals much and reveals little, yet beneath the surface the record persists. The presence of humans, their choicings, their cautious engagement with the material world resonates long after their voices and footsteps have vanished. The silence itself carries meaning. The traces remain, unclaimed, unresolved, yet undeniably ancient.
The wind sweeps across the stone, eroding edges, smoothing surfaces, yet cannot erase the decision that began it all. The hand that paused, the mind that lingered, the persistence of attention in a harsh, indifferent world, these endure quietly beneath layers of sand, beneath the dunes that rise and fall. The desert continues. Humans move across it, as they always have. Some traces are lost, some are revealed. Time and intention intersect in subtle ways, leaving a faint but persistent echo of presence. It is a record of survival, cognition, and reflection without words, without ceremony, without explanation. Beneath the surface, the carvings remain. They are not monuments. They are not art in the sense of later human comprehension. They are evidence of engagement, a conversation with the land that continues silently across millennia. Presence, continuity, observation, and attention are etched in stone, waiting for recognition, but not requiring it. And when the desert shifts, when wind buries, when sand drifts over stone, the trace persists beneath, waiting. The moment of deliberate pause, the hand held over stone, remains as inevitable as the sun's arc, as relentless as the desert itself.